I told everyone I'd come up to Apostles Bay to sort through my grandfather's old place, to clean it up, maybe get it ready to sell, and no one questioned it too hard. People generally accept that kind of story without digging. The truth, though, was that I'd left Chicago in a quiet sort of panic, slipping out of a life that had grown too stiff and too loud at the same time. Logan and I had stopped talking in any way that mattered. We went through the motions, but the connection had frayed into something unrecognizable. The house was more worn than I remembered. Shutters hanging crooked, yard overgrown, paint chipping in every direction. But it felt like a kind of relief, like the mess was at least honest. I spent the first night on the dusty living room couch wrapped in a scratchy blanket that still smelled like my childhood summers, listening to the wind move through the trees in that familiar way that had always made me feel both comforted and small. I saw Nate the next morning. He appeared just past the property line with a beat-up toolbox and the same half-smile he used to wear when we were kids, daring each other to jump from the dock. There was something in the way he stood there, casual but solid, like he already knew I'd show up eventually and had just been waiting for the moment to unfold. "Looks like the place could use a hand," he said, not pushing, not prying, just offering. I didn't give him the whole story. I didn't have to. He started talking about the rough winter they'd had, how the lake ice cracked loud enough to wake people at night, how the general store had finally switched owners after decades. It was ordinary talk, but it meant something because it filled the space without demanding anything from me. I let him fix the porch light while I swept off the steps, and for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about what came next. The days fell into a kind of rhythm that wasn't exactly peaceful, but gave my mind something to do besides circle the same old questions. And as I worked my way through each cluttered drawer and creaky cabinet, I started to realize just how much of my grandfather's life had been left untouched, like the house had been waiting for someone to come back and notice. One afternoon, while clearing out a box from the back of the hall closet, I came across an old cassette player buried under a stack of faded postcards and dusty fishing maps, and curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a tape labeled only with the date, nothing else. When I played it, the voices were low and crackling, but I could recognize my grandfather's slow, deliberate tone and another man's voice that I didn't know, tense and clipped, like they were arguing but didn't want to be overheard. I couldn't catch much. Just fragments. A mention of the line we can't cross and something about her not knowing. But there was a strange urgency in it, something that made my skin prickle. I tossed the tape in the glove compartment of my car without much thought at the time, assuming it was just one of those odd relics families keep for no real reason. Nate kept showing up, always with something in his hands. A spool of wiring, a box of light bulbs, a six-pack of beer he claimed he'd brought for himself but always left behind. And while we never talked about why I'd really come back, the silence between us wasn't heavy or awkward. It was the kind that lets you breathe. We fixed up the kitchen together, pulled weeds from the front path, and patched the hole in the back porch ceiling. And somewhere in all of that I told him, in a quiet, almost offhand way, that Logan and I hadn't been a real couple for a long time. That we'd become strangers living in the same apartment pretending we were still on the same page. He didn't react the way I thought he might. He didn't offer advice or sympathy or ask for details. He just looked at me for a moment, like he was waiting to see if I'd say more, then went back to screwing in a light fixture and said, "Yeah, sometimes things just stop working." And that was it. Somehow that helped more than anything anyone had said in a long time. It was one of those thick July days when the air feels like it's pressing in on you from all sides, and I was walking back from the hardware store with a bag of sandpaper and light bulbs when I saw Logan's car parked crookedly in front of the post office. And for a second I thought I was imagining it. But then the door opened and there he was, stepping out like he belonged there, as if we hadn't gone weeks without a real word exchanged. He said he was just passing through, but we both knew that wasn't true. He'd come to talk, to ask what I planned to do, to see if there was anything still left between us to save or mourn or blame. I didn't tell Nate about seeing him. I told myself it was because nothing had happened worth mentioning, but the truth was I didn't know what I would have said if he had asked. That evening, we walked down to the lake just like we used to as kids, the two of us slipping into that easy rhythm again, where we didn't need to fill every moment with words, and the air was heavy with crickets and the slow lapping of water against the shore. I skipped a rock, badly, and asked him why he'd been so quiet lately, because the silence between us had started to shift, feeling less like calm and more like avoidance. He stood there, watching the horizon like he expected it to change shape, and finally said, "Because if I say something, then everything will be different." And it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even hesitant. It was just honest in a way that cut through all the noise I'd been carrying around. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I just leaned in and kissed him. Not with some grand idea of what it meant or where it might lead, but because everything in me said I had to. like I'd been holding back for too long and that moment had cracked something open. He didn't stop me, but he didn't move forward either. He just stood there, still and steady, letting the moment exist without pushing it in any direction. And when I pulled back, he looked at me like he wanted to say 1,000 things, but didn't trust a single one of them to come out right. Neither did I. 2 days later, sometime just past noon, Nate showed up at the edge of the yard like usual. Only this time he wasn't alone. There was a woman with him, tall and put together in a way that made me immediately aware of my worn-out jeans and paint-smeared shirt. He introduced her with a casualness that felt just a little too practiced. "This is Cassidy, a friend from Milwaukee." And she smiled politely, said something about how nice it was out here, and offered to help with whatever project we were working on. But her eyes didn't match her voice. They held that tight, measuring kind of look that doesn't come from curiosity, but from already having decided something. I told myself it was nothing, just an unexpected visit. Nothing to read into. But the way Nate kept glancing between us, not quite meeting my eyes, and the way Cassidy never really engaged, always staying just close enough to seem present and just far enough to keep me at arm's length. It all felt loaded in a way I didn't want to name. I kept smiling, kept acting like everything was normal, asking her about Milwaukee, complimenting her boots, thanking her when she handed me a hammer. But underneath all of that, my mind was racing, trying to figure out whether I'd imagined the weight of the kiss at the lake or if this was his way of quietly redrawing a boundary. Later that evening, while cleaning out the car to make room for a run to the dump, I reached into the glove compartment and froze for a second. Because the cassette, the one I'd found in the closet and tossed in there without much thought, was gone. I searched everywhere, even checked the floor under the seats and the pockets in the door panels, thinking maybe it had just fallen or I'd moved it and forgotten. But it wasn't there. And I knew with that strange certainty you can't explain that it hadn't just vanished. It had been taken. I didn't confront Nate. I didn't bring it up at all. But something shifted after that. Not in any dramatic or obvious way, but like a door that had been opened just a crack was now quietly pulled shut, leaving only the echo of what might have been behind it. The town's summer fair came at the end of July like it always did. Same creaky rides hauled in on rusty trailers, same booths selling maple candy and driftwood art, same clumps of teenagers pretending not to be bored. I went with a group that somehow included everyone. Nate, Cassidy, a few people I only half remembered from childhood, and even Logan, who must have caught wind of it and decided to show up like he was still part of the picture. He tried to pull me aside near the kettle corn stand, said he just wanted a few minutes to talk, to clear the air, to understand what was happening. But I shook my head and walked away, not because I was angry, but because I honestly had no idea what I would say if I stayed. That night, after everyone had gone home and the fairgrounds had gone quiet except for the buzz of leftover generators, I came back to the house to find something waiting in the mailbox. A small, nondescript cardboard box with no return address, just my name written in a rushed, slanted hand I didn't recognize. Inside, wrapped in an old newspaper, was half of the cassette I'd found earlier. The magnetic tape unraveled and snapped like someone had yanked it out in frustration. Tucked beneath it was a photo, one I hadn't seen in years, of me and Nate as kids, maybe 8 or 9. Both of us soaked from the lake and grinning with our front teeth missing. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "What's lost doesn't mean it's forgotten." I didn't sleep that night, not because I was scared exactly, but because I couldn't make sense of what the box meant, who had sent it, or why it had felt like a message and a warning at the same time. The house, which had been starting to feel familiar again, suddenly felt too quiet, like the silence was trying to press itself into me. The next morning, word spread quickly that Nate's mother had suffered a heart attack in the middle of the night and had been taken to the hospital 2 towns over. By the time I heard, he was already gone. No note, no call. Just disappeared, like he'd been pulled into something heavier than anyone could stop. The funeral was quiet, held at a small church just off the highway, with more silence than speeches, more nods than words, and by the time Nate came back to the house next door, it felt like the weight of everything that hadn't been said between us had solidified into something neither of us knew how to carry. I saw him late in the evening, sitting alone on the back deck with a mug in his hands and the kind of expression that doesn't invite conversation but also doesn't push it away. I joined him without asking, and we sat like that for a long time, not looking at each other, just watching the trees shift in the breeze and listening to the old boards creak under our weight. When I finally spoke, it wasn't to ask about his mother or the funeral or anything that might have given us an easy way in. I just asked if he was okay being back, and he didn't answer right away. Just sipped his coffee, then said, "If you leave, I'll understand." He didn't say it like a challenge or a plea, just a fact, like he'd already made peace with the possibility. I didn't know how to respond at first, because it wasn't about staying or going. It was about whether anything between us could exist in the space between who we used to be and who we'd become. I asked him, not out of anger, but out of real curiosity. Did you think I'd come back different? And he nodded slowly, like he hated that it was true but couldn't pretend otherwise. I nodded too. Not because I agreed, but because I understood that whatever had been growing between us wasn't enough to hold everything we were both still trying to work through. 2 days later, I packed up my things. There was no dramatic moment, no final conversation, no slammed doors or last-minute confessions. Just the sound of boxes shifting in the trunk and the quiet understanding that this wasn't a goodbye designed for closure. I didn't leave a note, and I didn't wait for him to come outside. I just drove until the lake was behind me and the road started to stretch out wide and unfamiliar again.